Mr. Sullivan.
Yes, Mr. Jackson. Even though it's been a short time, it's a pleasure to hear you again.
It's just, I think it hasn't even been 24 hours. That's right.
Yes. So, yes, I'm thinking about some of the things that we were talking about at lunch yesterday, and
me too.
I think that there's a great game changer if a process can be created whereby entrepreneurs can take the ideas that they have of new possibilities, new techniques, and they're able to turn it very easily some way into content. In other words, putting it in a form, either in vocal. In other words, it could be audio, it could be video, or it could be text. And we were talking about that yesterday, and I think that's a great breakthrough for any entrepreneur when they can produce content.
Well, what I realized in the last little while here is that we've been having conversations about conversation being our kind of sweet spot of the thing that is our kind of winning zone. And then what I realized when I was in Phoenix right before we were at Genius Network was the multiplier of conversation is when you can turn it into something digital. Because that was where I hadn't understood or made that distinction, the difference between the analog nature of talking to people, just having conversations that are not captured, and having or writing things in a journal or writing, or thinking thoughts. All those things are sort of analog and potential energy or potential things until they are recorded. And once you record an audio, once we capture this conversation, this now becomes a multiplier. It becomes an asset that we have the opportunity to, we can turn this into text by getting it transcribed. We can turn it into a podcast, which we've done. We can take little sections of it and overlay some illustration or images with it and make it a video. There's so many ways you can multiply that, but are all based on conversation, And I think that I think talking is the winning move. It's the highest bandwidth output from our brain, and because rap more than typing. Creating text on its own. Text is sort of, I think, the lowest version of, least multipliable version of primary output. Like if you're just strictly writing, then somebody would have to you'd have to go backwards, to have somebody read it to turn it into audio. And to overlay video on all of that. But audio has the most potential derivatives of it, I think.
Why do you think that is? I mean, from your perspective, I agree with you, and I'm just, going through it in my mind as you're talking about it.
Well, everything. First, just the speed and ease for one thing. Like if we look at it, that what we're talking about, ideas in their packaged format, packaged being digital now format, is going to take one of four forms. It's either going to be audio, it's going to be video, it's going to be text, or it's going to be pictures, right? Images. There's only four core outputs. And when you look at that, everything else is kind of a derivative of that, right? And when you look at the ease of creation, to write something is, for some people, it's probably their comfort zone of being able to do it. But you and I, for us to go off alone and write, that's a procrastination-inducing thing, you know?
Very much so.
Right, because, so there's no, you can't really collaborate in the creation of the written word as your primary output source, right? Like we're talking about capturing ideas from your brain, ideas into a tangible, digital format that you can share. Now, video, on another version of it, video is a really great thing, and a lot of people, feels like it's sit back and watch a movie is kind of the most engaging thing if somebody wants a fully immersive experience. But the downside of it is that it's the most complicated to capture, requires the most setup, the lighting, the camera, the thing, then all of the stuff that goes into doing that. And yet it also requires the most attention to consume it.
Yeah.
You have,
and then,
it requires full immersion.
Yeah. And I would say that for most people, it's the scariest medium. If you ask people, if I can just talk to you for a few minutes here, and we're going to record it, and then what's been recorded can be easily edited, or it can be transcribed into text. So, the parts you don't like will come out, but you don't have to concentrate on anything here except the conversation. I'm going to ask you a few questions and everything else. And there's an ease to it because people are used to talking all day. From morning till night, people are involved in dozens of short, medium-sized, or perhaps even long conversations. But it's something that is very, very easy. And I think writing's harder, but you can go off by yourself and write, and people do write because they text every day, or they send emails every day. But being videoed is a strange activity for most people. It's
I agree.
And I've found ways of making it comfortable for myself, but I made a concentrated effort to do it, and it took me a couple of years to find a mode that one is that I felt very confident about, and secondly, I have a team around me which does all the howing work to get it done.
So studio.
I got a studio.
You've got a studio. You've got that fancy the teleprompter dealio, the mirror prompter, whatever.
I think it's called iDirect. Yeah. So anyway, but I think your point is really a great one. Just to reflect on what power, getting what is going on in your head out in a form that's independent of you. In other words, it's out there working. When you're doing other things,
becomes spreadable. It becomes shareable. Distribution.
It's multiplying you in the world. This is the big thing. And I was just reflecting, as you know, I have a real history itch, and I itch it quite a bit to go back and look at things because, there's a great deal of talk with the technological age about things going viral, but there was an interesting statistic that printing has in the Western world really, really starts in a major way with Gutenberg, because Gutenberg created movable type. And they didn't create printing. Printing had been around for, if you take China, which seems to have been the first place where printing actually started. But each, page had to be carved and, and imprinted. And but what Gutenberg said, well, let's just make lots and lots of A's and B's and C's as little metal units, and then we can rearrange a whole page, and then when we're finished, we can throw all the letters back in the box, and we can do it again. We could do it again with other pages. Yeah, so that was a great breakthrough. But within 30 years, or I'm just thinking of the number 1455 is generally considered the beginning of printing in Germany. There's in a town in Germany, and within a quarter century, there were 30,000 presses like Gutenberg's all over Northern Europe, which kind of told me that there was a real hunger and a thirst for people to be able to get their ideas down and get them distributed out into the world. And I mean, when you get such a huge jump in the manufacturing of these presses, because there must have been a tremendous demand that people really, really wanted. One, on the sender side, there was this tremendous desire on the part of people to get their ideas out there, or their news, or their thoughts, or whatever it is. But on the other hand, there must have been a huge audience for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about what other ways would they have had to procrastinate back then?
Well, it would have been.
It gives them a wonderful thing. I'm going to read now to procrastinate.
Yeah, it would have been handwritten.
Exactly.
And there were scribes. I mean, you could hire someone to write things out, but it couldn't be mass produced. Each one was a one-off. And one of the things I've noticed, Dean, because I've been in the business of talking to entrepreneurs about their plans for the future since 1974, where I'm getting paid for this activity of just sitting with you and asking you all sorts of questions about what you'd like to do with your future. And then I would draw pictures of this. I would actually draw diagrams, and I'd give them big sheets, of the results of our conversation, and they could look at that. And I did that for close to 15 years and made a good living at it. I mean, it was escalating over the 15-year period, but it was all conversation-based, and it was triggered by questions that the person hadn't really thought of before I sat down with them. I mean, that's where my whole idea of the question, that I've really formalized, which is the 3-year question, where I ask, if we were having this discussion, it was 3 years from today. It's the 17th of December in 2017. So we're talking about the 17th of December in 2020, and we're having a conversation on that day. And you're looking back to today over the 3 years, what has to happen over that 3-year period in your life, both personally and professionally, for you to feel happy with your progress? Well, the person's never had that question before in their life, and all of a sudden their brain rearranges itself and thoughts come out, and they're forced to make choices about this and that, and it's very lively. And it was such a valuable exercise, me asking that question and them answering, that they would pay me just to sit there for an hour or 2 hours, whatever the time period was, and then show them, in written documents and diagrams and everything else, what they had said. But they had no access to that information before I asked them the question.
Right. That's great. There's something, the thing about the pictures, which was another form of that digital kind of output, is that I think that images, drawings, charts are the way. This is one of the things that really magnify the concepts that you have, is the accompanying illustration that goes with it, that somebody can see, or the simple form the thinking tool that goes along with it. And that I really think that combination of
I think it's very
the
powerful
thinking tool with the audio explanation of it that's the power move.
Yeah, and we had a good example of that in the workshop when you came on Thursday, and we got into the conversation, the distinction between having a thought about a future improvement where you're making things bigger and better, and which question do you ask after you have this picture? And, we've been talking about this probably for the last 5 or 6 of the Joy of Procrastination podcasts here. And, it makes all the difference in the world if you ask yourself who rather than how. In other words, if you ask yourself how, then you're into the thick of it, and you it's hard labor. But if you ask yourself who,
it's really been interesting because I've actually thought. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but I was just saying, as you were explaining this, to the entire workshop, and it had a huge impact on everybody. I mean, when we went around the room at the end of the day, about half the people, about 30 people there, and, about 15 of them said, that distinction between how and who is the takeaway. That makes all the difference in the world. But I went up to the whiteboard, my magic board, and I actually diagrammed out what you were saying at the same time that you were saying it.
Yes. And it made a difference. And what I really liked about the way that you diagrammed it was that I've been diagramming it, from the top down in a vertical format, like representing, the units of time down the left side of the page, and the moment you have that what at the top, and then the forking to either the how side or the who side. And when you were doing it horizontally from left to right, what really made it, I think the nice thing that neither of us saw coming was that when you decide to go down the who path, you forked the path up and to the right. And when we went down to the who or the how path, it was down and to the left, which there was so many implications in that first of all, when you go who, it automatically implies and requires a collaboration. So when you go down how, you're automatically putting yourself down into an isolated and linear.
And I think it's, that's another really important distinction, because there's a radical emotional difference between collaboration and isolation.
Yes. Yeah, so I thought it really tied in well with your with what we've talked about with collaboration. But that whole idea that it's an elevator, it's elevating you up when you're thinking who and cooperation and collaboration, then striking yourself, limiting yourself to, because I imagine then as you go up and to the right, time moves, it moves faster because you're doubling up. When you're going down the how path, you've slowed yourself right down to the linear single minute at a time of your own time.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing. I've been, I have the exercise of producing a little book every quarter that is accompanied by cartoons, and so I'm always working with my cartoonists. This next week I'll have 3 meetings by Zoom. So it's at a distance. He's about 1,200 miles away, but on Zoom he's right there. And in Zoom, he can actually pull the text up that we're looking at, and we'll look at the pages, and we'll pick out the key ideas. And then he'll actually draw a little outline of the pages that are going to be diagrammed. And we'll sit there for about 15, 20 minutes, and we'll go back and forth. And, we'll just fill it up with the elements which best support the text, but not just sort of slavishly, reproducing the thoughts, but actually grabbing the essence of the text and then creating pictures for it. And he actually does it right on the screen with me. He's very fast. It's the same as McDonald. But the thing that I've learned, over the years, just being a graphic artist myself, but also collaborating with a graphic artist, is that progress is always to the right and it's always up. And if you try to represent it in any other way, it doesn't work. And so when I was doing that, and I came to the fourth, absolutely, who had to be up and to the right, and how it had to be down. And I was thinking maybe I should have looped it backwards, the fourth for how, that not only were you going down, but you started curving backwards. Like
yeah, that's true, because then you have to loop all the way around to get right back to.
You're actually looping back on yourself. You haven't gotten anywhere. You've actually regressed rather than progressed, in the sense that before you only had this bugging you. Now you got something else bugging you. You've added to your load of isolation, frustration that you have. And I think that's really what procrastination really is that, and you get fearful of having new thoughts about the future, because every time you have this new thought and you immediately, default to how am I going to do this, you've just added to your burden of frustration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I've been saying this, that, deciding to go down that how path is like writing a blank check that's payable with your most valuable asset, your time, in an unknown amount. You don't know how long it's going to take you, and you're no guarantee of what the result is going to be. It's the most uncertain thing to bank on. Whereas if you are collaborating with somebody who is a known getter of the result of the what that you're trying to accomplish, they know how to do it. You can write a check with your most renewable asset, which is money. Yeah.
Isn't it odd? It struck me as odd. I'll see if it strikes you as odd, that here we are with every year showing more and more digital capability out in the world, and we're kind of going back to the most fundamental skill that human beings have, as we've, as we progress from the beginning of the Joy of Procrastination podcast in July of 2016. Isn't it interesting, as these digital tools multiply out there, that the only safe space for humans is actually conversation?
Yeah. It's comforting. It's fantastic.
I find it, because I can talk forever.
I can too. And what you find is that just the derivatives, the stuff, like I'm realizing, and I'm not even doing it, I'm throttling back on the output that I'm capable of in terms of the amount of things I could say, because I know that each hour that I talk is a there's so much derivative that comes from it that it's create. I'm working with 3 different writers right now to keep up with the thing, and that's just with doing 3 different podcasts.
Yeah, and it can't for the world. It can't just be all Dean all the time, because there's got to be room there's got to be room for all Dan all the time.
That's exactly right. That is funny, Dan. I told
we got to work out some boundary lines here between our talking territories.
I said to it's almost unfair. I said to Joe Polish the other day, I don't know whether I told you this, but at one point, when I had launched my new listing agent lifestyle podcast for the realtors, at one point between you and Joe and I, we had 5 of the top 200 podcasts on the marketing section of iTunes, which was really pretty fascinating, right? Because we had I Love Marketing, we had the
Joy of Procrastination
talks. Yeah. Our Joy of Procrastination was the only one that wasn't on there, but we could have had it on there. We had 10X Talks, Joe's Genius Network, my More Cheese, Less Whiskers podcast, and my Listing Agent Lifestyle podcast. So we had 5 of the top 200 at one time on there. Now, occasionally when we release a new Joy of Procrastination episode, we get up there. So it's possible that at some point we could have 6 of the top 200 podcasts on the charts between the 3 of us.
Yes, and all we were doing was having a good time.
Good conversation. That's the one thing in common. And, no fanciness required. That's what's really, when people get the idea that they want to start entering this digital world, right? They want to say, okay, well, I want to start getting my conversations out there. They immediately get stuck into, well, how do I do that? How do I pod? How do I get it on iTunes? How do I record? How do I do this? How do I, all this whole long line of how thoughts that get in the way of them actually doing the stuff. And a lot of times I just think when you combine the things that I've learned from you with this in terms of the 80% approach, when we take this, I think that you look at this, our Joy of Procrastination podcast, my other podcasts that I do alone are all truly 80% approach podcasts in that we don't have a theme. We don't have a theme tune. We don't do any editing on the podcast. There's zero friction in creating it. The closest thing we have to a theme tune is me opening the conversation with Mr. Sullivan. That's the beginning of it, right? I mean, but what do we need the theme tune for? It's really from concentrate.
Yeah. Here's an interesting thing, and so I don't really do a lot of listening because I'm a born reader. I mean, I'm a born conversationalist, but when I'm by myself, I'm reading, and it's usually not books. It's usually I'm on the internet, I'm surfing, and I'm looking for interesting takes on something that I hadn't thought about before. Okay, so there are, there's algorithms that you have that will search for what you found interesting before, and they'll direct this stuff to you. But that's not interesting to me because I've already covered it. What I'm more interested in is going across and I say, oh, gee, that's an interesting thing. I hadn't thought about that before. Then I'll go in, but I don't want it to be long. In other words, I should be able to grab it in about 5 minutes. I mean, if it's really interesting, maybe I'll spend 10 on it. But if it's going to take me more than 10 minutes to, get the value out of it, it's too long for me because I want to do a lot of this. A Jackson unit is
one Jackson is all it takes.
One Jackson, beyond one Jackson, it's the author hasn't done a good job. He should have gotten me right right up front. But here's the thing about that. Podcasts where it's just one person talking at the audience are of no interest to me whatsoever, of no interest.
Right.
And I had an interesting contrast because there's a guy, people say, you should listen to Sam Harris. Sam Harris is really neat. And Sam Harris has a podcast, and Sam is famous for being mostly an atheist. So he's in the atheist community, Sam Harris is a big star. Okay, and I listen to him, and he's very smart. He's very smart, and he speaks extremely well, and he's got he's very, very, incisive logic. But after about 3 or 4 minutes of him, I'm starting to drop off. And then there's this other man, Scott Adams, who's famous for being the cartoonist who presented Dilbert. And he's got a lot of interesting ideas. But I listened to him for about 4 or 5 minutes, and I said, this is kind of dry. And I'm finished with it. But last summer, I was listening to a podcast on Sam Harris's podcast where he interviewed Scott Adams.
It's a combination.
And I listened to the whole thing for an hour, and it was scintillating. So just one person talking doesn't do it for me. And so with one exception, I have a thing called multiplier mindset. But I keep those to about 5 minutes. I never talk more than about 5 or 6 minutes because I found that that's about the maximum time frame where you can go just yourself, getting an idea across.
Right.
But you're different. You're different. You talk in a different way, and I was noticing that when you were talking the other day in the workshop. You have a speech style that can. It's almost like you're having a conversation with yourself. Okay, like there's two Deans. Like you've managed to create a kind of a 2 Dean track. You have a very, very interesting speech pattern which doesn't wear out beyond the 5-minute mark. So I just wanted to pass that on to you. I just noticed that you've hit upon a particular way of talking which can kind of keep the listeners going. So obviously you're successful with your longer audios. And I think you've actually, whether you're conscious of it or not, you've actually hit on a particular way of talking. And I think it is, you leave real pauses in your thinking, and it creates a little tension. You'll say something, and then there will be a pause, and immediately, because you're not talking right away, the person says, oh, what's coming next? And then you talk again. So I wanted to point that whatever you're doing, don't change it.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think, part of the thing that as a, coming from a copywriting background, or, writing, I've sort of trained myself to write as if I'm writing to one person. And maybe that's the thing, is like I've kind of trained myself to speak as if I'm in a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, but interesting.
Yeah, and most people
say it exactly the same. Yeah, the same way I would say it if I was just talking at length to you over lunch.
Yeah, and most people don't. Most people have a writing them and they have a talking them, and there's a vast difference. Yeah, and I think that's the schooling system. The schooling system has trained people to write in a way that's not as interesting as their conversational style.
To address an audience. Yeah.
Address an audience and make sure your sentence structure is right and, and everything like that. And I think it's, I think most people who are interesting as talkers have been trained out of being interesting as writers.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, it's so it's funny because and I try and avoid doing that at length myself. Like I really enjoy the conversational element of having conversation with somebody. Setting up a context for a conversation is kind of my go zone. That's the one I really like. But this, as a listing agent lifestyle podcast, it was a lot easier to procrastinate the first foundational episode of that, where I laid out the 8 elements of the listing agent lifestyle, and it was a full hour that kind of sets the stage, which now is being converted to the book. And so this has been a really great example of taking audio and going through all the derivative parts. Like I've gone through it with More Cheese, Less Whiskers. Now what I'm doing with Listing Agent Lifestyle is that recorded that one episode that sets the foundation and the context, and now every other episode will be with a real estate agent who is either winning at applying the listing agent lifestyle principles, or we're helping them get the right action plan for working on any of those elements. And turning that first episode, that 1 hour, into a 90-minute book as a opener to the conversation, because I talk about that 80% approach that I learned from you, and that's really what makes these that makes a small a shorter book a viable thing, is that you get it takes so much less effort to 20% of the effort for 80% of the result of a bigger book, or maybe in this case, if you're using it as a lead generator, 100% or more of the result that you need for it, and using that as a way to attract the right people, like offering offering the book, the listing agent lifestyle, to the people who that message is attractive to. And in one plane flight, like you talked about it's a book that you can read in an hour and get completely up to date on the foundational things of the concept. And then, now that you've got their name and their email address to begin a dialogue with them, the podcast now is really the rest of the book, if you want to think of it like that, right? Like, rather than take 6 months to write a capital B book, the winning formula that I'm seeing now is spend 90 minutes to write the 80% approach book with the title that gathers the right audience, and spend the next 6 months recording podcasts that have a conversation with that audience, or that would be interesting to that audience. And then seeing what we've been able to do with all of that audio. Yeah.
I mean, if people could write a book in 6 months, that would be fantastic, Dean. But I've heard 5-year projects, 10-year projects. I mean, this is the absurdity of that approach, and and there's some research which will show why this is so absurd. So I remember back 10 years ago, and you still had in the United States, Barnes and Noble was a huge, and there still exists. They've got, actual stores, and I think that they're coming back with more stores. But Borders was other kind of twin in the marketplace, Borders and Barnes and Noble, and Borders went under. So they disappeared. And I used to love some of the Borders stores. I would go to Borders, hang out in Borders, and they become big clothing stores.
Wasn't it Borders that made the mistake of partnering with Amazon for their online delivery stuff? That's fine. You stay in your lane. You handle the bookstores. We'll do all the online.
Yeah, watch out for the devil. Watch out for the devil. Anyway, don't get into strangers' cars. I was told that as a kid. If a smiling stranger says that they'll give you a ride, don't you get in that car. Anyway, but one of the things they could do, because they both of them got into the early ebook, that you could buy a book just simply by downloading it onto your phone. And one of the things they found out is that fiction books, for the most part, are read from beginning till end. John le Carre, Grisham, those people. They have, they sell hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of books, but they can track the downloads electronically, and they can see how far the reader went with it. And generally when it's fiction, and remember, fictions are stories, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, people will complete that. But nonfiction books, they found generally it's about 4 or 5%. The person will get into it and kind of get into it. I mean, there's this famous book about 4 years ago. It was called Capitalism in the 21st Century by a French writer, Thomas Piketty, Pikety, from Paris. And it was a rave bestseller. It was the number one bestseller. And a lot of people had downloaded it electronically, and whether it was Amazon or whether it was Barnes and Noble with their electronic readers, the average reader read 3% of the book, and yet it was a bookseller. Have you read? Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, this is a fantastic book, and people are recommending it. And people who have read 3% of it and couldn't get any farther are recommending it to other people to download it and read 3% and not get any further.
Isn't that amazing?
I actually read the book, in portions over a period of time because I wanted to see what he was saying. And there were about 4 or 5 chapters in it, which if he had taken those 5 chapters and produced 5 books, he would have had a lot more impact. Impact. But bring the chapters out. And I've had people who are, entrepreneurs who are 5 to 10 years into a project, and they've got 30 chapters, and they're going to, it's bigger than War and Peace. It's approaching both Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible. That's how big it is. And they keep learning new things, and they say, I need another chapter. And in the meantime, over the last 10 years, they could have had 30 books.
Yes, I agree. See, that's the thing. This is where this is the secret formula that I've discovered, is that when we talk about my 8 profit activators, right? Select a single target market, compel your prospects to raise their hand, right, to identify themselves. It's about turning an invisible prospect into a visible prospect. That's the purpose of a book in Profit Activator 2, is to compel somebody to say, I want that book. That sounds like something I want. And so if that's your purpose, if the outcome, beginning with the end in mind, if the outcome is that you are in conversation with somebody who resonates with the title of whatever it is you're offering, then that's a win for the book. Now, all that you need to make that happen is you've got to have a book. You got to have a title that upon reading it, the person you want to be in conversation with says, I want that book. And you got to have a way for them to get it. Those are the only three things that you need to make that, that check that box and move into now Profit Activator 3, which is about educating and motivating people, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing more educating and motivating than a podcast, a conversation, it's much more engaging. It's almost like, I think about them as one unit. I think about it as one thing. That's the latest evolution that I've had is let's use the book, short book, to get there, to get the idea across, say this is what we're about, and then invite people to come and listen to this podcast as the next step in that. And then when you've got that podcast listener, now every week you get an opportunity to continue the dialogue with that person. They get to know more about you.
Well, the other thing here is that I've seen another danger of the long book approach is that it's taken you 5 years to write the book, during which you've been trapped inside of your own ideas in isolation for 5 years. You haven't been collaborating with anyone during those 5 years because you didn't have something to give to someone else that you could actually give their feedback. And you had the thought, well, I can't possibly show this to someone until it's finished, or else they won't get the impact. So you're trapped in your own isolation. But then, having put all that work in, you're not only trapped for the 5 years before delivery, you're trapped for the 5 years after delivery, or the 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, some people are, like Marx, they're trapped in it. He brought out this little book in 1848. This Karl Marx, the father of communism, Marxism.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, he brought this little book out, and I think it's 1848. It's called The Communist Manifesto. You can read
little
it.
Book. When you say little book, how are we talking about? Would it be the size of a 90-minute book?
Yeah. You could read it you could read it start to finish in about an hour and a half. Okay. And it took the world by storm. And then he starts writing these huge tomes. Tome being a monstrously large book.
T-O-M-E,
Yeah, T-O-M-T-M-O-E. And everything. And I said, you had him with a short one, Carl. You should have gone out, and you should have just started discussion groups all over the world just on the book, because everything that gave energy and fire to the communist movement came out of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, I disagree with every idea in it. I found it very inspiring.
That, to me, there's something about that. Like I've been looking for examples of movement-making books. Like that. Well, that is certainly. That's a.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know that it was.
The other one is Luther. Martin Luther, who is the author of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, he's the. He's the dynamite stick that produced the rebellion. This was in the early 1500s. And by the way, he could only do it because of Gutenberg, because what he did is he created pamphlets. And so a pamphlet was just a huge sheet of paper that was printed on both sides and then folded into, so that there were 16, there were 16 pages when you folded them, and that was called the pamphlet. But you could print it in
the Reynolds papers or whatever, the what Hamilton was part of.
The Federalist paper. The Federalist papers,
or pamphlets.
Federal, yeah.
Right?
Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Yeah, they produced.
Right.
And I think there were 90 of them, 95 of them. Yeah, there were a lot of them. But they were broadsheets that were just folded once, then folded twice, then folded 3 times, and folded 4 times, and you ended up with 16. But he put actually just a broadsheet and nailed it to, he nailed it to the door of a particular church. I think it was in Augsburg, Germany, and it was 32 demands that he made against the Catholic Church, and it went. And then it was reproduced, tens of thousands of times and sent all over Europe. But
what is this one called?
Which one?
What the one you're talking about?
Luther's Edicts. It's called Luther's Edicts. I think there are 32 edicts, and because
converted into a book form.
Oh sure, sure. I mean, you can go on. Yeah, you can go on. It's probably just reproduced as pages on Google. But if you go Luther's 32. I think it's 32 edicts. You'll do that. I mean, you can read it. You can read the whole thing in about 4 or 5 minutes, and it's just his complaints against the Catholic Church. And he was the first person to do this. And his first thought was to reform, the existing church, but then they typically, with a large bureaucracy, they responded negatively. And so he says, well, I'll start my own church. And off we go. And but these things are real short. These things are real short. The things that start revolutions are real short.
That's interesting. I'm going to look at both of those because that's a thought that's brewing for me. One of the things that people often have as mental blocks, they want to buy into how easy it is to do a 90-minute book, but then some voice in their head is saying, well, it's got to be more than that. It can't just be 50 pages. It's got to be more than that. Or it can't be a conversation. And I was looking, I'm pretty sure that it's Orson Welles. Who would be a contemporary of Orson Welles? If there was another filmmaker that would be like that, of that era, that wasn't Orson Welles, who else would it be? Because I think it is where I'm getting.
Probably John Ford, John Ford, 30s and 40s.
Okay, so where I'm going with it is there's a book that is one of the most coveted books among filmmakers that sells in reprints for hundreds of dollars, is a book that has 2 names on it, like Truffaut and Wells, or Orson Welles and Truffaut, or somebody, and all it is it's a transcript of the conversation between this guy from France who got Orson Welles to agree to sit down with him for 3 days and just let him ask him everything about filmmaking, right? About his approach.
Yeah.
And
I've got another one for you along the short variety, not necessarily a conversation, but short one. It's Gordon Moore, who the famous Moore's law that governs the technology world. That the speed and power of the microchip will double every 18 months to 2 years, and the price of computing will drop in half. And this seems to be an exponential trend. This was written in a magazine article in a technological magazine in 1965, and all he was using was 3 data points over previous data points, and he said this is a very fascinating invention, this integrated circuit we've created, because it seems to exhibit this exponential behavior, and it caught on like wildfire, and everybody just locked into it. And it was just an article that he wrote.
That's something. See, I love that. I love that.
So we have three of them. We have Marx, we have Luther, and we have Gordon Moore. So that's a nice.
I was thinking about Machiavelli, the Prince.
Oh, the Prince.
That's a very short book. Yeah.
So if you really, really, really want to create a new consciousness in the marketplace, and you want to get an instant audience that has huge emotional buy-in, go short, don't go long.
Well, it is, but I think the great thing is that I think that the long version of it is that make the rest of the book a podcast.
Yeah,
because then you can spoon feed the ideas every week over the next several months or even years if you've truly got a conversation that's worth listening in on.
Well, I have one that'll be a nice test one. So with a partner in Detroit named Mark Young, who's a member of the 10 Times program. Mark owns an advertising agency. It's a packaged goods. He advertises for all kinds of packaged goods. And I met him at Genius Network 3 years ago, and he's got kind of a resonant political view about the United States. And I, 3 or 4 years ago, I came up with this idea of the American checklist, which is a checklist of 8 mindsets that if you're an American and you have these 8 mindsets, you're going to be a happy and successful American. And if you're an American and you don't have these mindsets, you're going to be a miserable and procrastinating American. So anyway, that's the essential thing. So we've started this podcast, which we're launching in January. But Mark also has a internet radio show with a partner, Chuck Woolery. Remember Chuck Woolery from the dating game?
I do. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And Chuck had 7 successful TV shows over a period of about 45 years. So they invited me on the show. They interviewed me on the podcast, and they had, in a single month, they have 1 million discrete listeners to this, from the, in a 30-day period, they'll have 1 million. And in the radio show, they interviewed me about the podcast. Chuck hadn't heard about it, and he was fascinated that you could bypass Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, everything just by focusing on certain mindsets. It's laid out like one of my mindset scorecards.
Yeah,
and we're pushing the podcast so that they can download the podcast, but also they can actually download the scorecard. And then Chuck called a whole network of resonant type radio stations who have 4 million listeners. So they're going to replay the radio show on that network. All the network of other shows are going to replay the one where I'm interviewed, and Mark and I are interviewed on the. So that's 1 million listeners plus another 4 million listeners. And it was just an hour of my time. It was just an hour. So it'll be interesting to report on what how fast it goes through, because, the mindsets are real simple, and, it's individualism, ingenuity, having a feeling that it's, what you're doing is exceptional. And, Did
you turn that one, have you turned that interview, the conversation, into a book yet?
No, but we're still building. So we're going to build the book through. We're going to build the book through the podcast. So we take one mindset per show, and then we talk about it, and then we'll just download the key points from the podcast, and the book will write itself. And anyway, but it's really an interesting thing that. You can pretty well grasp the entire idea of what I'm talking about, maybe, 7 or 8 minutes. 7 or 8 minutes. And if you listen to the podcast, you get the fill in. But it's really demonstrating what we're talking about here.
Yes.
This is huge.
I like it. It really is.
Just to pull it back to procrastination, you can see why entrepreneurs who believe, that to communicate anything to the world, I've got to spend a long time, and it has to be 100%. I can't dare go out there if it's not 100%. How that would just lead you to endless procrastination.
Mm-hmm. This has been one of my favorite conversations.
I love this.
Yeah.
I love this.
It's so good because I think this is a new, we created some new thoughts here out of this. I like that.
I think we did, and I think we're revealing because we're not talking just about things that are true in the 21st century. I'm going back, with Luther's the 16th century, with Marx it's the 19th century. Gordon Moore is 50 years ago. And everything else. This has always been true. If you want to get something going real fast and you want to attract the people you want to attract, you got to go short. You can't go long.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And then you have to have the means of having a constant conversation with the people who respond to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what the podcast does. So great. I love it.
I'm delighted. A Sunday hour well spent.
It really is. It really is. I'm glad because it wasn't on the schedule, but I'm glad we got to squeeze in an extra Christmas bonus one. It's awesome.
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Dan. Have a great Christmas. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.